This is fair.
But they're fantastic movies.
Yes. I will go on record now as saying that, I mean, I may be not thinking of something, but if I were to think of not necessarily a horror franchise, but like a horror sci-fi franchise, this one is probably my favorite, just because I honestly think it is the most unique and interesting franchise that to come out of like the horror sci-fi genre. Because each movie has its merits. Some are better than others. Some are kind of but they all have something interesting in it.
Yeah.
And, you know, the one consistent thing through these 6 is Peter Cushing, who is badass.
The best.
The best. All right, so let's do a little bit of history leading up to where we're at with these 2 films in particular. So, and I'm kind of going off the top of my head here. I don't have too many notes or anything, but so kind of what was said in the introduction. So, Frankenstein as a story is written by Mary Shelley at the age of 18 in 1816, which is probably where I got her age mixed up when we talked about it before. She was married at the time to Percy Shelley, famous poet. And
Percy Jackson.
Yes, and the Sea Monsters. There was a lot of rain involved, though, so there is that. Close enough. Yeah, I don't know how much of this is specifically true, how much of it is just legend, but the legend goes that there was like this one particular, you know, the summer of 1816, which I guess I heard somebody refer to as like, you know, the summer where there was no summer, because it was just constant rain and storms and terrible weather and people being shut up inside and not able to go out and do anything. It was the pandemic of its day.
Damn.
And I guess Percy Shelley and his relatively new bride Mary, who he married when she was 16, because that's what they did back then. Oh. They were staying at the same villa, cottage, whatever, of Lord Byron, who was also a writer, and I believe Byron's doctor, Dr. John Polidori. And again, weather-wise, they couldn't get out, they couldn't do anything. So as you did back then, when you had no TV, no internet, no anything, they're like, I'm bored. Let's have a horror writing contest. Not sitting around the fire and telling a tale off the top of their heads. No, let's all go off and write a ghost story. And they did. That apparently took a weekend. And I think, if memory serves me correctly, Mary was the one that was having trouble coming up with an idea. Everybody else kind of comes up with their own stuff. And then she ends up one night over the weekend having a nightmare. The nightmare was essentially the birth of the creature. And she has this nightmare about this young, you know, scientist, this young man in an attic space somewhere with this body that's very obviously been like stitched together from parts of others, and then the body starting to like come to life and the eyes flickering open and whatever. It terrified her. She had a nightmare. She woke up, and she came up with the concept from there. So it's actually kind of weird. The same story writing contest that gives birth to Frankenstein also technically gives birth to the modern vampire story, because John Polidori ends up coming up with a story that he ends up publishing called The Vampire, about a character named, I believe, Lord Ruthven. And that story, even though it's not quite the same as what we usually, you know, figure as far as a vampire story, that actually predates Bram Stoker's Dracula by almost a century. Figure this is 1816. I think Dracula was published in 1897, if I'm not mistaken. So quite a few years beforehand. But anyway, so Mary eventually, when she tells her story, is encouraged to write it down. She publishes it first as a novel in 1818. Has to go through numerous publishers just to get it published, because most of them are like, nope, we don't want to do that. Nope, we don't want to do that. Nope, we have no interest. I think eventually it gets published through like one of the more low rent publishers at the time, and it's just like, whatever, we'll put it out. It was published anonymously. Some people, you know, theorized for a while when they started to hear that it was from her that it wasn't really her story, but it was actually her husband Percy that wrote it. All this other shit. She eventually goes back some like 12 to 15 years later and then revises it and republishes it in 1831, and that's the kind of more commonly available version that's out there. Not a lot of drastic changes from what I know, but she polished it a little bit. I mean, obviously, I'm sure her skills have probably increased since she was 18. So then it kind of goes on. It becomes its own thing. It's not a massive hit as a book at the time. Kind of like with a lot of things, the book doesn't really become the hit. It's more of the adaptations that become the hit. Like Godfather, Jaws, things of that, where it's like, oh yeah, they're books. But nobody ever really talks about the book. They always talk about the movie.
Godfather was a book?
Exactly. There you go.
Oh, okay.
So it doesn't really become like a major hit until it starts getting adapted for the stage. The most major first stage production, I think, is called, because they have cheesy titles back then, they called it Presumption or The Fate of Frankenstein. And yeah, I know. And then a lot of the elements that would end up making its way into the later movies, like the hunchbacked assistant character of Fritz gets introduced in that play. Fritz, who then kind of morphs later on into like the standard idea of like Igor, which we'll talk about that when we talk about the Universal ones at some point, because that's very confusing. But yeah, a lot of the elements that would be utilized in the movies come from the plays. A lot of like the action set pieces, the big massive creation sequence originates on stage, which makes sense because in the book I believe she just injects him, or she has Frankenstein inject the monster with just like this liquid or some. It's very vague how it's described in the book, and then it just sort of comes to life.
Hearing about that.
Yeah, and then it's like, well, for the stage, for the theatricality of people sitting on stage wanting to see this thing come to life, you don't want to just come over and be like, and then it goes, no, they want some big crowd-pleasing, apparatus and whatever else, and that's where that kind of originates from. The first film version comes out in 1910 from Thomas Edison Studios. So the man who invented the light bulb and also invented the film camera, his studios are the first ones to produce a Frankenstein feature, which is 12 minutes long.
He's the man.
He's a famous inventor. Swear to God, if you don't know who Edison is, then...
Of course I know Edison.
All right.
Jesus.
Okay. No, he's not Jesus. He's Edison. Get it right. So that comes out in 1910. I think there might have been a couple other now lost silent versions in between. The next major production is released by Universal Studios in 1931, directed by James Whale, and that is like the famous Frankenstein, starring Boris Karloff as the monster. And that is the one that is pretty much like the one that is in everyone's minds when they think of the Frankenstein monster. That makeup, that square head, the bolts coming out of the neck, the scar on the head, and the black outfit and the big thick boots and everything. Every character that if you ask a kid, like, what's the Frankenstein monster look like? And they draw you some crude drawing of the Frankenstein monster, it's going to look like that. That's how iconic that image and that makeup is. So that series begins with Frankenstein in 1931. They then make a direct sequel in 1935, The Bride of Frankenstein, also with Karloff. They take a couple-year break, and then they come back and do Son of Frankenstein in 1939, also with Karloff. The big difference, well, not the difference, we haven't discussed this yet, but the main drive here is that for the most part, the Universal series would follow the monster. The monster would be the same in every movie and eventually played by different actors, but it's still the same creation. And as the series progressed, it became less and less about Frankenstein as like character or story. The monster becomes less and less a part of the overall story. Eventually they start doing the matchups like Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, House of Dracula, where there's, the monster, Dracula, and everybody else. By that point, like, the monster barely gets off the operating table, and of course it finally culminates in 1948's Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which is just a setup of the entire genre. That's in 1948. Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein is pretty much, even though it's a classic and I love it, it is the movie that basically said, okay, we're done with Gothic horror. The whole idea of like the creepy castles and the the Victorian settings and that kind of horror movie is kind of over at that point. You're then getting into the 1950s, and the 1950s ended up being much more sci-fi based. There's a lot of the apprehension about the science gone wrong and the nuclear age and things like that. All of a sudden, you get movies in the 1950s that are all about giant irradiated ants, giant tarantulas, giant monsters coming up from the depths of the sea. You get the original Godzilla in 1954 that's awoken by the atom bomb and
Jeez.
all that kind of shit. And even the horror stuff that was coming out at the time, for the most part, would be sci-fi based. So even like late Universal horror, like Creature from the Black Lagoon, yes, it's a monster, but it's still like more of a science fiction monster. It's some like throwback Gill-Man, whatever. The gothic horror is kind of taking a back seat, and no one's really doing that anymore. The closest you would get to something like that I can think of at the time, at least in the States, is, and I want to say it's 1954 or 55, somewhere around there, Warner Brothers releases House of Wax with Vincent Price, which has at least like a Victorian setting. It's not really like a gothic horror movie like Dracula, Frankenstein, and all that, but it's got those like tropes to it. So, and that becomes a big hit. That's also one of the first 3D features, which probably helped, but that becomes a big hit. Around this time, overseas in England, you have this very small British studio called Hammer that for the most part had been doing a bunch of like crime movies, film noir, black and white, pretty all black and white, nothing color for them at the time. Very low budget, and they've been around for years. They've been around I think since like the 30s, and they were relatively successful, but nothing that really like made a big splash anywhere. And then 1955, I believe, they end up obtaining the rights to a BBC television serial called The Quatermass Experiment, which, again, a science fiction story written by Nigel Neal, and it was, again, written as an episodic BBC serial. It's, however many half-hour episodes that appeared on TV, and it was very popular, huge hit, whatever else. So Hammer's like, hey, let's strike while the iron's hot. Let's take this, long form series and adapt it as an hour-and-a-half feature film. We'll play off the name recognition. We'll cast a well-established but kind of washed-up American actor as the lead, Professor Quatermass, whatever. That becomes a huge hit for them. But the main thing is that they found that people were really responding to the horror elements of it, because even though it's science fiction, Quatermass Experiment is essentially about an astronaut who went on an experimental, rocket into space. Everyone else in his crew is killed. He comes back supposedly fine, but he's been infected by some kind of like alien entity, something or other, and he starts to gradually morph into a creature, like an alien creature, and that's what scared the shit out of people. So all of a sudden, Hammer's like, "Ooh, horror might be worthwhile." And then they start thinking, well, what can we do? And I think around that time, they were actually approached by a couple other producers with a script for a Frankenstein film, which they showed interest in. And then I don't remember the complete details, but essentially they took the idea, didn't like the script, decided to make their Frankenstein movie anyway, but without those people. And then, went on to success, and those guys were like, well, fuck you, we brought you the idea. I believe it was Milton Subotsky and a couple other guys that were involved. They would eventually go on to form Amicus Pictures, which ended up being the number one rival to Hammer during that time, and they would utilize Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, a lot of the same people, and make other types of movies, horror movies, but different types. So essentially Hammer's like, okay, based on the success of Quatermass Experiment, let's go all out this time. Let's give it a shot. We're going to do an adaptation of Frankenstein. We're going to shoot it in color, which this actually marks, it's not the first horror movie in color, because I think that would actually be House of Wax, but it is the first British color horror film. It's definitely the first color Frankenstein film. And, obviously they're putting more money into it. At the time, they get a substantial TV star, Peter Cushing, who had been in their BBC version of 1984, George Orwell's 1984. He's a huge TV star at this point, and they managed to nab him to play Victor Frankenstein in the series. What was I going to say? I'm getting there. My train of thoughts. Yes, anyway. So, yeah, I think the whole point was that it was supposed to be like a one-and-done type thing, which we'll discuss, after we saw the movie. He's like, oh, yeah, this is not intending to be the beginning of a franchise. It's just like, hey, let's give it a shot. But it ultimately ends up becoming a massive hit, both here and, more importantly, in the States. So now Hammer's not only a success within their own home country, but they're also making waves overseas and getting overseas distribution, which they hadn't before. So it ends up becoming like a massive hit, and then that leads obviously to, let's replicate the formula. Well, Frankenstein's the main one. What's the other main one? Well, let's do Dracula. And then let's see if we can get other ones. So they start making their mummy movie, their werewolf movie, their Sherlock Holmes movie, and then they sequelize a bunch of stuff, and then it's all history from there. But it all originates in this one-off Frankenstein film, which is intended to just be yet another tale of that book, and then it morphs into something else completely, which is the first one that we watched.
The Curse of Frankenstein?
The Curse of Frankenstein.
Oh my god. Finally.
You were just waiting for me to say the name?
A half hour later, we're finally talking about
the movie we came to talk about.